Hi, I'm David Coleman with the National on CBC News, here with Randy Dignard, who is a workplace instructor. The company is
Industrial Safety Trainers.
Industrial Safety Trainers, and Randy does a lot of things for employers, and of course a lot of employers now trying to figure out what to do around cannabis legalization, what it means for them, what it means for their employees. We've been looking into this issue, and it's interesting because, you know, we have seen, for instance, the police forces who are employers in this country. So the Toronto Police have said one thing, the Calgary Police have said one thing, the Ontario Provincial Police have said one thing. All their officers can either smoke 24 hours before duty or 28 days or not at all. And you see this right across the country with different employers. Total hodgepodge, Randy.
Oh yeah, it's a mess. Everybody's trying to figure out how to deal with this new cannabis laws that are coming into place.
So if you're an employer, an employee, or you just kind of have a question around what cannabis legalization means in the workplace, totally want to hear from you about your questions. So some of them are starting to come in already. For instance, are employers allowed, Randy, to dictate how much or whether employees can use cannabis on their personal time?
On their personal time, no. Not as a rule, unless you're in a safety sensitive position where they say, if you're sometimes like a police officer or transportation, where it's thought that the cannabis may still be in your system, and, and if it causes a risk to yourself or others, especially the public, then they can say, you can't have it in your system prior to. But there's no standard as to what that's going to look like. It's whatever they want to make it.
Yeah, because that's the big question is, like, let's say I consume cannabis either through an edible or I smoked right before coming to work. How does an employer know that it was right before coming to work or the weekend before or the week before?
They don't know.
They don't know.
They don't have some businesses, can do drug testing.
Yeah.
But most businesses can't say we're going to just do drug testing. You can't just do that, right?
Yeah.
Under the Human Rights Code, you just can't do that. So what happens is the problem is if somebody comes into the workplace and the employer thinks they've been smoking drugs or eating stuff or they may be high, the problem is that under health and safety laws, no matter what province you are in Canada, it says that every employer has to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of a worker, which means that if you think they might be high, you have to do something about it.
Yeah.
Right. So depending
Which
on,
isn't firing them.
No, it's very difficult to say you're going to get fired if you come into work high, because you have to consider addictions, prescribed medication. Some people may be taking medication and they double up on the medication.
That connects us with a question coming from Brian Rosso, who's on Facebook and asking, what about medical cannabis? So the idea of cannabis that's coming to you through a prescription. Are employers obligated to accommodate those with medicinal marijuana?
Yes.
Yeah.
If any prescribed medication, they have an obligation to accommodate. Problem is that you got to tell your employer what it is, because not all cannabis you take has a THC in it.
Yeah.
So a lot of it, if it's in a cream or it's in an oil, a lot of times there's no, it's not going to make you high.
Yeah.
Right.
And you need the THC to make you high. If it's CBD only, which it is for some people.
Yeah. But if you have it, you have an obligation to tell your employer about it so that they can build an accommodation plan. So depending on your job, you might have something where you're working in an office and it might not be an issue. But if you're operating a forklift, now it's a big issue, right?
Okay, so employers, Brian, to answer your question, employers are obligated to accommodate those who have a prescription. The onus is on the employee to declare that they are on the prescription and exactly what it is. Another question coming from Jim Steves, also on Facebook, asking, can a company turn you down for a new job for having cannabis in your system from the weekend?
What, just as being hired on?
Not hire you because you have cannabis in your system from the weekend.
I wouldn't think so, because it could be discrimination.
Yeah.
Right? Because if somebody has a problem, they're taking medication, you can't discriminate and say, well, I'm not going to hire you on because you're taking this medication. But
if it's recreational?
Recreational, no, I don't think so. They could, because what you do in your own time is your business.
And Jim, one challenge around this is just testing. The testing regime here is still pretty limited, so it's hard to tell if someone smoked on the weekend. I mean, if they're looking at social media and they see that a potential employee has been smoking that weekend, well, I suppose that could totally influence things. But in terms of testing, it's hard to know, did someone smoke this morning or over the weekend or a week ago?
No way of knowing.
No way of knowing. Aaron Sue Salt on Facebook is asking, why isn't this treated in the same way as alcohol? So I guess, Aaron, what you're saying is you can't come to work drunk, so why should you be allowed to come to work high?
That's right. Yeah, it'll be treated the same as alcohol as far as, you can consume alcohol on your own time. You just can't come into work drunk.
Yeah.
Right. You can, in Canada now, you can smoke cannabis or take cannabis products, right, on your own time. You just can't come into work high. Problem is that employers, if they think you might be high, they have no way of knowing. So under health and safety laws, they have to say, if I think you're high, then you need to go home, or you can't work, or they have to deal with it somehow, right? So depending on what job you're doing, it might be, an office environment. If I think you're high, am I going to allow you to work or not? The question is can you hurt yourself or you can hurt somebody else, right? But most companies now are developing policy says that if we think you're impaired, right, then you're not allowed to work. That's the most common thing that's happening.
That's the bar that people are looking at. Just a quick recap of who we are and what we're doing here. I'm David Common here with Randy Dignard, and I'm a journalist with CBC News The National. Randy is actually training companies right now who are trying to figure out what cannabis legalization means to them, means to their employees, means to their human rights protocols, and the way in which they don't enforce, what the rights are of employees around that. One question that has come in is what happens if your employer accuses you of coming to work high or of being high on the job?
Employers have an obligation, if they have any reason to believe that you may be high, they have an obligation under health and safety laws, taking every precaution reasonable, to investigate. So just because an employer is investigating and trying to find out if you're high or not, right, they're perfectly allowed, they're expected to do that. If somebody says, well, I think that guy over there is smoking a joint at break time, and the supervisor goes, I'm just looking at him, he looks okay, and doesn't do anything about it, and there's an accident, and it's found out that that supervisor knew that there's a possibility and didn't investigate, that supervisor can actually be charged under health and safety laws.
It's a big liability issue for employers.
They have to investigate. So it's not, I'm not accusing you of anything, I'm trying to determine whether or not you're impaired or not. Problem is that most supervisors don't know how to determine impairment, right? Like how the average supervisor, I said, well, how do you know if somebody's high? Well, I don't know. I just, so now what you're starting to see in Ontario and across the country is training for supervisors on how to recognize what impairment looks like, right? If somebody's sleepier than normal, is too chatty, is laughing too much, is sweating, they got some shakes, there's all kinds of signs that they can see in an employee that might trigger them to think, I don't know what's going on with that employee, and I don't know what they took, but I don't think they're fit for duty right now because they're not, so they...
You don't necessarily know what the kind of impairment is, but you suspect that they're impaired, and if they're in a safety-sensitive job, and that could be anything. It could be just driving a car to go somewhere to pick something up, or up on scaffolding.
Now the focus is that it's not just cannabis. Cannabis has got everybody thinking, and now they're saying, what about prescribed medication? What about alcohol? What about extreme fatigue? These are all things that causes impairment. So now businesses are looking at not just drugs and alcohol in the workplace, and you can't have drugs. It's about impairment and all the forms of impairment.
Yeah.
And
I'm just gonna cut you off, Randy, only because we're getting a lot of questions here. So April, John, Lees, and Patty, we got your questions. They're coming right up. April Cheney, you're first up, saying, what about employees who work for cannabis companies and end up traveling to the United States? Any advice around that, about what they should declare? These are not necessarily people who are consuming. They may be, they may not be, but they are employed by a cannabis company. We've heard all sorts of kind of horror stories leading up to this, and now with legalization of people traveling in the United States. Anything you would add on that?
Cannabis is still a Schedule I drug in the U.S., so you can't bring it into the U.S. I was surprised traveling recently that if you're traveling within Canada, you can now bring cannabis with you on the airplane.
On the plane, as long as it's within Canada.
Within Canada, but you have to declare it. As far as going to the States, I know there's a lot of discussion about, if you tried cannabis, and I'm not sure where the border is, security is going with that.
Yep.
And I don't know exactly whether or not you work for a cannabis company or not, what effects that have, I don't know.
April, I can say to you, just from some of the things that we've heard here at CBC News from people who may be in this position, both those who work or invest in cannabis companies, those who are somehow connected to the industry, that it's kind of haphazard. It really depends often on who you get on the other side. We have heard of people, for instance, having their Nexus cards taken away. We have heard of people being denied at the border. And we don't have all the information around it, but it does appear that it is connected to either they invested in a cannabis company, a major investor, speak for the industry, work for a producer, those who are having trouble. Now, you can sit there and you can say, well, I'm just not going to be upfront about it. The challenge is, of course, if you do that, it's a gamble. If they look you up, they can Google you and find out information about you, and it shows that A, you work for a cannabis company, and B, you've just lied to them, then you may have a problem. It's a catch-22. I think the Americans are still trying to figure it out.
Still trying to figure out what that's going to look like.
John on Facebook, John Spencer asking, operating a train, bus, aircraft flying high, is that safe?
No, obviously it's not safe.
Yeah, and we've
and
seen
those-
WestJet and Air Canada.
Those are the
those are
organizations that have policy and procedures saying that if we suspect you have taken drugs, they can demand testing, a urine test or a saliva test or something like that. Those are the ones who are allowed to do that right now.
But we got an interesting case here in Toronto that's been going on for the past couple of months. The TTC, the Toronto Transit Commission, which runs the subways, has a woman who I believe is on CBD pills. Now, CBD is the non-psychoactive side of cannabis, and so it's not the thing that gives you the high. She uses it to deal with ongoing pain that she has, and the TTC has said to her, no more of the CBD pills because it is a marijuana derivative, and instead she's on an opioid. And that has created questions about what the most appropriate thing there is. Again, for everything that the science tells us now, and science is limited, CBD is not the thing that gives you the high. THC is. Just to move on quickly to another question, Lee's Chloe Brown on Facebook asking, I take taxis a lot and I wonder how to ensure that my driver is safe to work. How would you know?
As a rider, you really have no way of knowing.
That's not too comforting, is it?
Well, it's obvious, if you go in there and the thing smells like a pot factory inside, maybe the guy, smells it. But the reality is that most people are taking the edibles, oils. There's all kinds of different ways of taking it. So if they are taking those ways, you're never going to know.
Yeah.
Right? The only thing you can do is be aware of your driver, and if they seem to be, not going at the green lights and they're acting weird, you might want to just get out of the cab and grab another one.
I can tell you anecdotally, friends of mine took a Lyft ride similar to Uber recently. They got into the car, it reeked. They had the car stop, got out, pressed the 0 on the lowest or the 1 rating, and immediately Lyft called them, said what's going on. And they said, well, we think the driver's high based on what the thing smells like. And boom, the car was off the road. They wouldn't give him any more riders. We know some cab companies, for instance, in Calgary, we looked at that.
Well, here's something. What happens if you're at a pot party and you get in the cab and you get out of the cab shortly afterwards? Is it possible that the cab may still smell? It's like
do you hotbox the cab?
Yeah, like are you going in the cab and just the passengers are stinking it up? You don't know.
Some taxi drivers are concerned about the impact of secondhand smoke. Certainly if someone were to consume, to smoke inside their cab, which generally you can't do anyway, whether it's tobacco or cannabis. But even the notion of what if you just put it out and the odor's still around you and you get into the cab. There are questions around that. I digress. Patty, Vincenzo, John, we've got your questions. Patty Banks Hall is picking up on something we were asking before. Is if there's no way to prove that someone is high, how can you as an employer send them home?
The employers are not obligated to prove anything. All they have to do is have reasonable suspicion that they may be impaired, and that's all they need. So if they're thinking, you know what, I don't know what you're doing, I don't need to prove. I just need to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances. So if I think you're impaired and I think you might be a risk to yourself or others, then I have no other obligation but to take action. And sometimes that means sending you home.
Vincenzo is commenting and saying sometimes people can perform perfectly fine or even better when they've used cannabis. And I think Absolutely, there are indications that people appear to be fine. I mean, if we look at, alcohol, 0.08 is the limit we've all kind of grown up with and understand. But there is a number for cannabis, but it's not really well tested out, and we don't have a sense of what it would do to you compared to me, compared to someone walking down the hallway here. It can be different in everybody.
Yeah, it's the same. Think about the first time you had a beer and the effect it had on you when you had that first beer, and versus years later and many beers afterwards, you don't get the same effect. So I'm thinking that a lot of people are going to try cannabis for the first time in a long time, and they a couple of puffs on something might be enough to send them off, where a more seasoned smoker it wouldn't, right?
I'm just going to point out something. We were talking about the transportation industry a bit earlier, and we were talking about those who work as pilots. Air Canada is actually pointing out to me that it will not allow its pilots to use cannabis 28 days prior to flying. They have an outright ban for safety-sensitive positions, including pilots.
Yeah.
That's coming from Peter Fitzgerald, who's a spokesperson with Air Canada. Thanks for watching, Peter. Let's just move on here. John Watt up on Facebook says, what about all the years before it was legal? Nobody questioned employees then. Now it's an issue.
And the new laws have brought that question about, and you're right. It's been a lot of workplaces have had problems with workers coming in, possibly smoking up before coming into work, or coming in high. But in the past, nobody knew what to do about it. Right? If you went to a supervisor and says, I know the workers are smoking up, but I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And because of all the new changes in legislation, it's forced companies to look at their policy procedures and adapt those policy procedures to address that. And one of the things that we're seeing more is education for the supervisors on what to do. If you say to your supervisor, listen, if you think somebody's impaired, this is what I want you to do, step by step by step, they're going to go, oh, okay, I get it now. Where before, if you left it to them, they didn't know what to do.
They didn't know
so they ignored it, or they just sent the guy home because they thought he was high. But now
there's also a difference between, like, it was illegal a month ago, and now it's not. Now, what's it being enforced? We can debate that. But the whole notion of, if you're an employer and you suspect that your employee is doing something that's technically illegal, well, there's a different bar there.
Yeah.
Now it's a legal activity.
Now it's come to focus that if the supervisor knew but didn't act on it, now they're all saying, well, you're going to be responsible for that worker. And so now the supervisors and employers are going, well, hold on a second here. I don't want to be responsible for them. If they come in to work high, what am I supposed to do, right? Like, I have to send them home now because I've allowed them to work. And so now there's this, the reasonable suspicion is where there is a training program where they teach supervisors and employers on how to recognize harassment or impairment.
Yeah.
Just the same as the police officers do, right? So a lot of people don't.
So the whole idea of.
Well, yeah, like, are you allowed to say to a worker, listen, I want to do a bit of a sobriety test just to make sure that you're okay? And they've never done it in the past because they didn't think they could. But the reality is, if it's a tool that a supervisor can use to determine whether somebody's impaired or not, then use it, right?
Okay, so this actually is a good segue for us to get to Paulo's question, which is, what can an employer do to prove an employee is working while impaired? For instance, can an employer demand blood tests be done on an employee?
No, they can't. But we got to understand, it is not the responsibility of an employer to prove that they're impaired. They don't have to prove what they're on or how much it is, right? The police do that to convict somebody of an offense. But what an employer has to do, all they have to do is have reasonable precaution or take a reasonable suspicion that they are impaired. Mm-hmm. As long as I think you might be impaired, then I have to take action on it.
Okay, so what does an employer do if they have a suspicion?
What they do, first they need to investigate the impairment, right? So one of the courses we offer is an investigation course on what to recognize, looking at their demeanor, looking at their speech, looking at, is this not normal for that worker? And if you can demonstrate, normally they're like this, but now today they're doing this different, they're doing that different, and there's all these things that are different, right? for that reason, I'm thinking you're impaired. I don't know what it is, but
It could just be fatigue.
it could be, yeah. And we talk about impairment. It's not just drugs. It could be alcohol. It could be extreme fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, what's more likely to happen in a workplace? Somebody being 1 or 2 hours sleep coming into the workplace. Are they a danger as much as a guy who maybe smoked a joint, right? I'm thinking the guy with 1 or 2 hours is probably at more of a risk for himself or others.
Yeah.
So you have to consider all forms of impairment, right? And not just the cannabis part of it, right? So the the supervisors, they need to be able to recognize what impairment looks like. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of your police forces, when they stop you on the side of the road and they got those commercials that says that, if you get caught impaired, you can be fined and sent to jail and that. Well, the police officers, what their evaluation is, it's about a 70-question quiz. And they go and ask all these questions, and if they get enough markers that say, all
Like
these
what are
things.
2 or 3 of those things?
One would be your speech. One would be, your eyes are a little off. They ask these questions, and they ask them different ways. And if you're all the answers are all over the map, that would be all that does is give them reasonable grounds to go to the next step, where it says, you know what, I think you're impaired. Right, because all these markers are being hit here. So now I'm going to make a demand for your saliva, blood, or urine at a hospital. Normally with alcohol, if they smell it and you're talking funny, you're unsteady on your feet, then they say, you know what, I'm going to arrest you right now for impaired. I'm going to take you back to the detachment, and I'm going to do a test there. And that test will tell me. If it's drugs, then they take you to the hospital and they do those other tests.
That's a cop, though, not an employer.
What's a cop? Yeah, that's right. So employers can't do that, but employers are not going to charge anybody or convict anybody. The only time you'll see that happen is if there's been an accident in the workplace and it's thought that that person might have been impaired, then the police are going to take over the investigation and they'll go to that next level. But for employers, all they need to know is, do I think the person might be impaired for whatever reason? They don't need to prove nothing, right? All they have to do is say, I think they are because of these key indicators.
Yeah.
The problem is that most employers and supervisors don't know what questions to ask. And
because this isn't about firing someone; it's about whether they stay on the job or not.
It's
right?
about making sure that they're safe and that workers are safe.
Yeah.
Right.
Got a bunch more questions here. Josh is saying, why is this all of a sudden a big deal now? It's a good question, Josh. Has there been a string of incidents where people not using cannabis before October 17th legalization day? From what we know, from the work that we've done here at CBC, has there been a string of incidents? Certainly not that we have recorded. Any increase or anything like that. What we do know, though, is because of legalization, companies now have to incorporate cannabis into their HR policies, big or small companies, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. And that's kind of what you do for a living.
Yeah, this is one of the most significant changes in our laws in Canada. I can't remember the last one that was so significant. So that is causing workplaces to address this. They're being, all the lawyers are saying, you need to address this. You need to make sure you got the stuff figured out, because if something does happen, you could be held accountable.
Nick Cook is on Facebook saying a zero tolerance policy, for instance, the one that the Calgary police have, others have, will not stand up in court. Comment, he's saying, certainly lawyers who look into this kind of thing have made the same assessment. It hasn't been tested in court. Probably will be, though.
It's going to be tested in court. The zero tolerance. Now, a lot of the police forces and the airlines and the transportation companies, they've had drug testing for years and years now, right? So this is nothing new to them, right? The ones that are going to be impacted most are all the other companies who have never had this in place, right?
Terry, we got your question about how good the saliva tests are. Nate's right before you in the lineup. So just a quick thing. Why can I take prescription pills at work, but not medical marijuana?
You can take medical marijuana at work, right? You just have to make sure, and same for prescription pills. If your pills or your marijuana causes any kind of impairment, you have an obligation to tell your employer about it, just so they can look at it and say, you know what, does that create a problem for you? Is that prescription going to create a problem for you or others? And if it doesn't, then it's business as usual.
Is that a legal obligation? Like it's something you should do or something you must do?
There's no law that says you have to.
Yeah.
What it is, the companies have to develop a policy procedure that says that, this is how we're going to deal with medication. This is how we're going to deal with alcohol. This is how we're going to deal with fatigue.
Whether that medication is medicinal marijuana or whatever it is.
Yes,
right?
yeah. And usually what they do is, and those policies are, what I'm seeing is, All they're saying is if you have something or you're on something, could be Percocets, could be any kind of medication, you just need to let us know so we can build an accommodation plan for you. Sometimes it's short term, sometimes it's long term, and the employer has to work with that person to try and figure out what's the best thing for the worker, the co-workers, and the employer.
Question about the saliva tests and how good are those saliva tests at determining whether someone is consumed?
I'm not an expert on that saliva test. I know that that's one of the things that the police use the most because it's non-invasive.
The one thing, our colleagues at the Fifth Estate here at CBC News have done a bit of work on this. I actually got an interview with one of the top Mounties looking into this. And the assessment now is a lot of the tests that are even being used by police forces in this country right now are either not sufficiently reliable or could well be challenged in court and may not survive, or are so early in the process that we just don't have the data to know how reliable they are. I don't have off the top of my head all the journalism that the Fifth Estate's done, but we're sure we can provide a link to that in the comments around what it all means. So that's a question, Terry, your question on cannabis. Tony asking, does this not affect your insurance and WSIB if you allow your workers to continue to use equipment while impaired?
I don't think that WSIB, if a business has a high rate of accidents, your rates are going to go up. That's not what I'm worried about. If it's found out that somebody was high and operating equipment as an accident, the Minister of Labour in Ontario or your safety officers in the other provinces, they're the ones who are going to say you did not take every precaution reasonable, and that's when they can actually charge and fine the company and even put people in jail. If they knowingly allow people to work impaired, and somebody got hurt, right, that supervisor can actually, in all provinces in Canada, could actually go as far as jail or fines or other penalties.
So, yeah, we don't know the answer, Tony, around impact to insurance or WSIB. You don't think necessarily there would be. It's a legal thing, right? But the notion of using equipment while impaired, if there's an accident, you're saying,
yeah,
then trouble can happen.
Yeah.
Annette's asking, what about employers that misuse the authority? And I assume, Annette, what you're saying, I hope I'm getting it right, misuse the authority they have around trying to determine if someone is high.
Well, the first thing is a company, again, I go back to the policy. If they have a policy that says if we have reason to believe that you're impaired, we're going to investigate. And when it comes to health and safety, some people, if I'm a worker, I might be feeling, you know what, you're abusing your power. You have no right to ask me these questions. The reality is they have every right to ask that question to make sure that you are safe to work, right? And they have to take every precaution reasonable. So sometimes, you know what, if it means asking a bunch of questions or doing sobriety tests.
What if you begin to feel like they're just harassing you? They're just they're trying to make you do this every single day, or that you're.
This is entirely possible. You know, with everything, you're going to get some employers and supervisors that are going to start questioning everybody, and it could be seen as a form of harassment in the workplace for sure.
Josh Gordon's got a question here. Can a company legally ban you from having a cannabis product on your person at work? This isn't necessarily saying someone using it, but just having it, whether it's an edible or a joint or whatever.
If they make it a rule at work, you cannot bring any kind of recreational drugs, alcohol or stuff in the workplace, then they can ban it.
Yeah,
and if they make it the rule, make sure everybody understands that that's the policy.
That's what the rule is. Okay, and Josh, I would point out that the law is different in every single province. I don't know which province you're in, but in Ontario, for instance, you cannot consume, and you're not asking about consuming, you're just asking about having it, but you can't consume in a workplace. Other provinces, a lot of them are like that. Some are not. Some say the workplace, only if it's an indoors workplace is it banned. So it really depends on where you are in the country. Just a quick reminder of who we are, what we're doing. I'm David Common here with Randy Dignard. I'm a journalist with CBC News The National. Randy is training a whole bunch of companies and employers right now on what they need to know in the wake of cannabis legalization. What does it mean for you as an employee or an employer? We're taking your questions today during this Facebook Live. Warren is asking, what if you think an employee is impaired and they are not, can you get charged for harassment or defamation? Spins out of the last thing we were talking about.
It goes back to trying to prove that they weren't impaired. So who's gonna now an employee, if they were sent home because they were impaired and they thought maybe they got it wrong, they can actually go to a hospital or a clinic and say, listen, I need to be tested right now for drugs in my system, and I need a report from that. And then they could take that report back to the employer and says, I took this like half an hour after you sent me home, and there's nothing in my system, right? So that would give evidence to the employer that they weren't, and maybe their evaluation process was faulted, or maybe it's too strict. I mean, when it comes to trying to figure out if somebody's impaired, and if you do this checklist, trying to figure it out, you know what? It's hit and miss, right?
Yeah,
there's no right or wrong
high
answer.
likelihood people can get it.
I'm looking at somebody and saying,
well, there is a wrong answer. If you think they're high and they're not, and you do your test and they aren't.
Yeah, like some people could just be having an off day. Maybe they're just a little bit tired, fatigued. Maybe they're just not feeling well. And if somebody's not feeling well, would they look like they may be impaired?
Yeah.
Possible, right? But the employer has to check it out. They can't just go, well, maybe he's right, and I'll leave it at that. Even if he does leave it at that, they should document that. I did look into it, and these are the reasons. They're not hitting any of the markers, and I think they're probably okay.
Warren, we did your question. Susan is commenting, I am allergic to it. When I smell it, I cough, I gag, I vomit. I get an instant migraine, feel like I have the flu. The neighbor is smoking. This is a good question, Susan. The neighbor is smoking, and it's coming through the ventilation, and it's in all my cupboards, closets, bathroom, living room, and bedroom, but it's a non-smoking building. Susan, I don't know where you're writing from. Here in Toronto, there was a case like this quite recently in a building that was deemed non-smoking, a condo building, with someone who was in a very similar situation to you, where they had an allergy and had a very severe reaction whenever they smelled this. Any thoughts for Susan?
Well,
it is a non-smoking building, first of all.
Obviously
right?
they have to go to whoever the owner of the building and address that way. I do know that in a workplace there are people that are allergic to certain scents. So a lot of workplaces have a scent-free policy and procedure saying you can't bring certain scents into the workplace. But as far as residential, it's going to be a problem because I'm more concerned about, or not to downplay that, but if I'm in my backyard and I got my kids there and the neighbor's having a pot party, right? That's going to be an issue. I don't know how it's going to be addressed, but it's going to be an issue. And with this caller here, I think they need to go to whoever owns the building and talk to them about that.
Or maybe you're in a condo and you have to go to the condo board. Not an immediate solution.
It's not against the law.
I mean, it's not against the law, and what makes it even more challenging is in basically every province, the one place you're definitely allowed to consume is in a private residence on private property.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a no smoking building, does that somehow override it? I'm sorry, I don't exactly have the answer to that. I'd encourage you to look up the Toronto condo example, though, and see what the person there found as an ultimate solution. Maybe if we have a link, we'll be able to post that as well, Susan. Tricky situation, though, to be sure, what you find yourself in. Patty's asking, what about an employer that does random drug testing? Is that still legal to do random drug testing?
Only those employers that are approved to do so.
Approved by who?
Well, not approved. It's if they have a policy that says that they do drug testing. Sometimes the policies they have says that it can be random. Sometimes it says it'll only be done after an incident's happened. It depends on what the company's policy is. But
and again, the challenge around testing is you don't know when someone consumed based on testing, and you're testing for what's illegal products.
The testing doesn't measure when they took it; it measures what's in their body, right at the time. So what the tolerance level is. When they do testing, the report goes back to employer saying this is what the results were. So the employer, sometimes they have a benchmark saying, if the levels are a certain level, that's not allowed, or wherever it may be. But they have to have a policy that allows it. Random workers cannot, or employers cannot just do testing. right?
Yeah, and even if they find cannabis in your system, again, it depends on what your job is,
Yeah.
because just because you find, I mean, cannabis is, there's
Cannabis
no,
can be in your hair for a month afterwards,
right.
right? It can be found in hair samples, right?
Okay, but if you test someone, this is a product that can be legally consumed by everyone of effectively the age of majority,
Yeah.
over 18 or 19 or whatever it is in your particular province. And if you're finding it in someone over that age, this is a legal product that's inside their body. Now, there may be specific policies that the employer has adopted that says you can't consume at all, and there'll be questions about whether that will stand up in court ultimately. Some employers have done that. There are others who do it at 28 days or 24 hours or 1 week, or pick the number. The challenge is trying to, there isn't a test that says this person last consumed at this time.
No, all the test says is this is what's in their body at the time of the testing.
Whereas when we do blood alcohol level, for instance, we don't know exactly when they consume, but we have a pretty good sense of when it was.
The testing they do right now, because it's been around for a long time, there's been a lot of research and there's a lot of data has been collected, and they say, you know what, if your blood alcohol level is at a certain level, and based on your weight, they can determine, not to the minute, but they can say, you know what, this person is drank within the last certain time period.
Yeah.
Right, because alcohol goes down about 10% about every hour thereafter you've taken it, right? So they can do the math and get a good idea.
And alcohol doesn't stay in your system for as long.
I don't know how long it stays in your system, but the testing they do at the police station gives you what it is right there at that time.
Rudy's asking, what is the difference between someone using cannabis for medical reasons compared to someone using it not for recreationally? They have the same thing as far as tolerance if you know how they're being affected, right? Well, I think ultimately they're like it's the same marijuana. It's not like there's
there's different strains of marijuana.
There's different strains of marijuana, but it's not as if these are the strains that are recreational and these are the strains that are medicinal.
Yeah, the difference is medicinal. It's a drug, and it's treated exactly like a drug. So when they sell you this stuff here, and they tell you this is the level of HTC that's in there, or THC that's in there, it has to be exact that. They can't have variables. When you get in recreational cannabis, there could be variables, right? Because you're buying the plant directly and it's not being treated like you would at a drug facility.
Yeah, although it depends on whether you're buying it still in the black market. If you're buying it in the black market,
you have no idea what you're going to get.
You don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
If you're buying it from the streams, the legal streams now, the idea is that the producer is supposed to have exactly what they say. So if it says 18% THC, I mean, this is another point that we haven't talked about, but the marijuana that exists today compared to the marijuana of 10 or 20 years ago is night and day in terms of the availability
One
of
thing
THC.
for question is, right now, all the cannabis that is being sold through the retail outlets that are available are coming from places that are selling it, doing medically.
Yeah.
So they're controlled. What's going to happen in a year from now when all the farmers are going to say, listen, I don't want to grow corn this year, I want to grow cannabis? Are we going to lose that tight control, quality control? Because now it's considered a food product and not a drug, right? So
okay, now
are we going to lose that quality where we know exactly what we're getting? That's going to be the next thing.
And there's our big turn. All right, let's pick up some other questions here. Jim's saying employers have no right to dictate what an employee does on personal time as long as it's legal and the worker's 100% sober when reporting for duty.
That's right.
How do employers know then if you're fit for duty?
It goes back to this course we're offering is called Reasonable Suspicion.
Yeah.
And what the Reasonable Suspicion course does is it teaches supervisors and employers how to determine if somebody's high. So they, just the same as the police have that big 70-question quiz, we've narrowed it down to about 20 questions, and we're saying, you know what, if you ask these questions and you're making certain observations, and if you're hitting certain key points, right, that may give you an indication that the person may be impaired. I don't know but they're impaired, and then they can deal with it at that time. Somebody might say, you know, did you have a joint after, before coming into work? And the supervisor, the worker says, yeah, I had one this morning when I woke up. Like, what's the big deal? Now the supervisor, if he does an evaluation and he's trained properly through this reasonable suspicion course, they may say, you know what, he's not staggering, he's not doing anything that's different. I'm looking at all the stuff here, and I don't think he's impaired because he's not doing anything differently. So I'm documenting it like everything's good, and you can go back to work.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's when it's outside the norms of what you would expect from that person.
and the supervisors need to identify what is outside the norms.
Yeah.
Right.
Cheryl and James, we got your questions. Zoe's right before you. Shouldn't the same rules for consuming alcohol or smoking cigarettes at a party in your neighbor's backyard apply? And I think, Zoe, what you're getting at is where you can consume. And it really is different. So, like in Ontario, the largest province by population in this country, you can smoke or you can consume basically anywhere. Like I think not a school, not a hospital.
Some parks. Yeah.
But indoor and outdoor, otherwise, it's pretty wide open. Whereas there are other places, we were talking about Nunavut, for instance. If you're in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, very limited where. And you can't even grow.
You can't. They put out a code of practice. You can't grow marijuana. One of the rules is you can't grow it indoors. And I think the reason for that is the mold issues that it creates in there.
So I mean that becomes a different thing. But there, to your point about shouldn't they apply, this is essentially up to provinces, provincial governments to decide where, and they aren't the same. So what is true in Ontario is not true in Quebec, is not true in British Columbia. The rules are different depending on where you are. Cheryl, what should the rules be if the person's job is a brain surgeon? My first thought would, of course, be I wouldn't want someone to be high if they were doing surgery. No kidding. I'd be with you on that, Cheryl. I'm wondering if I'm mistaken to make an across-the-board judgment because that actually helps the surgeon have steady hands.
Well, I'm thinking if you're a surgeon and you need to smoke a little pot so you can have steady hands, you shouldn't be doing surgical work on people. That's my opinion. But it goes back to the hospital. If they have the certain people that, what's their policy? Can they do testing for their doctors and surgeons and stuff like that? I haven't heard of it happening, but if they don't have a policy procedure in place for it, they're treated just the same as every other workplace.
I wouldn't put it outside the realm of possibility. The consumption of cannabis on at least a yearly basis is widespread. I don't remember the numbers, but many Canadians consume cannabis at least once a year. And so are some surgeons in there? Probably.
Maybe.
James, your question is next, and then Em and Nicole. James is saying, just because someone smokes a joint does not make them impaired. A joint for me is no different than someone going outside for a cigarette. I'm no more impaired than they are. That's James's take, yeah.
You know what? And I agree. Some people, they take it and they may show no forms of impairment. And you know what? They may not be impaired. Let's compare it to if I go out at lunchtime and I have a beer with my lunch and I come back to work, does that make me impaired? Maybe not.
No.
Right? So some people can go out and they can have a joint before coming into work and come into work, and they may not be impaired. Right?
It also, I think, James, like I'm not the expert on this, but it may mean by what you mean by impaired. Are you impaired and you shouldn't drive a forklift after smoking a joint? I guess that's going to depend on who you are. Different people will respond differently, as they do with alcohol. But if you're suggesting that there is no effect whatsoever to consuming, just going outside at lunch and having a smoke, I don't know about that.
I think a lot of companies, what they're saying is that, one, there's nothing wrong with employers saying during regular business hours, whether you're on break or lunch, there's no consuming any kind of drug or alcohol because it may cause an impairment, right? There's nothing wrong with them saying that. The question is when they come into work and they've taken something before they come into work, now all of a sudden they can't say you can't do that. Mm-hmm. But now the question is whatever you did, does it cause an impairment?
Yeah.
Right? So
and to what level is that impairment, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's just things are smoothed out a bit for you, does that make you a danger to be working with tools?
And
right?
that's where the company has to determine whether or not, what's their tolerance? I mean, if I have an office environment, it's going to be different than if I had a machine shop, right? Machine shop, I might want to have my rules, my policy in the company might be zero tolerance to anybody taking anything during regular business hours. If
Yeah.
you smell like you've had alcohol, you're going home. If you smell like you smoked a joint, you're going home, right? And that if that's the rule and it's communicated to all the workers, right, that's allowed.
You know, James, if there's one thing that we do know about all of this, it's about how little we know. So much of the medical research that happens in the world happens in the United States, and it is to this day basically illegal to do any research on cannabis and its effects on people in the United States. And that's a challenge. It's a problem for those who actually want to study this and really understand how different people react, what impairment looks like, what the effects are on the brain. There's still, you know, there's little bits that we know, but we are certainly a long way away from a full picture. I digress. M is asking, some people think cannabis makes you a safer driver. Can you help me debunk this crazy myth?
There's a lot of people that, I think the only people that say that are the ones who like to smoke it and drive. Cannabis is the same as alcohol. It's an intoxicant, right? People will get intoxicated. It's just a level that, what actually causes impairment, right?
Yeah.
Some people say, you know what, I have a beer or a joint is not going to have an effect on my driving. But as soon as they say it makes me a better driver, I have to question whether or not that actually does that. If you're asking a police officer, I'm a better driver by having a couple of joints before driving, he's probably have a difference of opinion.
Yeah, he's probably going to give you some bracelets, actually, ones that connect in the middle. That might be a challenge. There's not a lot of information out there about cannabis consumption, but it is abundantly clear that when you consume, you are impacted. And some people may think that makes them a safer driver. I suppose it's conceivable, but I'm not sure the law would necessarily agree with you if that caught up with you.
And one of the things, this course that we do, this reasonable suspicion course, what we've done is we've actually got retired OPP officers or police officers that are teaching this course. And when we're teaching this course, all these questions come out, and they're the ones who are the experts in Ontario on to answer those questions as far as impairment on the road and that.
Wyon, Susan, and Clay, we've got your questions, but Nicole's right before you, and this is a really interesting one. This is something we hear quite a bit. Nicole is saying, I've been smoking for more than 15 years, stopped for 2 weeks to do a bus driving drug test, failed, and now have no job. And Nicole's pointing out she's a recreational user. You're not alone. There are people out there who have been consuming for a very long time who stop, then fail a test. And there's even the question of people who are habitual, regular users, about what is considered a safe level, because does the body kind of normalize that in a way?
The unfortunate part is she's applying for a job that is very sensitive to that, and that job requires drug testing.
Yeah.
And if you're a recreational user, you might not pass those tests if that's the case. But that company has made it a policy that to protect the students or whoever their passengers are, that's within their right to do that. If they are doing drug testing, it's there for a reason, right? And they fail people sometimes.
Wyon, this is a good question. I know I keep saying that, but this actually fascinates me. So Randy, you teach the reasonable suspicion course, which is designed for employers to help them identify whether someone is impaired, be it from alcohol or drugs or fatigue or what have you. Wyon's saying, does that course include recognizing or removing prejudices?
The course is I don't understand the question.
I guess here's what we're getting at. There have been instances where I've seen this more in the United States, where they've done like a roadside sobriety test for someone based on they think they're drunk. Well, they have them do all of that. And if you essentially mirror what has happened to a white driver compared to an African American, a black driver, that they may perform the same way, but the black driver is deemed to have failed. How do we How do we address what might be ingrained prejudices that we have when you're trying to determine if an employee is impaired by whatever it is?
What we do is part of the investigation process is it's documented.
Yeah.
So there's a checklist. Have they done this? Have they done that? And it's either yes or no on the checklist. So hopefully by doing this, this checklist, it takes away any prejudice that's in there.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that we teach in the course is, just don't test the guy on what he's looking like today, right? Tomorrow when he comes back to work, do the same test on him tomorrow and see if it's any different.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to build a case, you're not sure, right? And that's what the police officers do. If they want to build a case against somebody and they think they're high, they go through the testing, and then the next morning, if they release them from jail, a common practice is they'll do that same assessment again to show the difference in the questioning.
And that's the key here is we're not talking about jail. We're talking about an employee. As an employer, you probably should know your employees. Get to know them, and what you're saying is this outside of the norm from the way that employee normally performs their job?
Yeah.
This is actually worthwhile for us to think about for our own journalism as we go forward. So I thank you for that. Susan is saying, could constant secondhand marijuana affect a drug test? My neighbor smokes it.
I can't say for sure with any certainty.
Yeah.
I don't know of any studies to show that smoking or inhaling secondhand smoke actually causes impairment.
There are actually studies, and I'll just pick up on that just because it is something I know a little bit about. Hotboxing, the idea of being in an enclosed space. So if you are in a large room, so this is like a part of our national newsroom here, so you can't see behind you, but it's just there's no walls here. If I started consuming here, is someone 30 meters away going to get impaired? No. If we were in a car right now in an enclosed space like this, would you get impaired?
Probably,
yes.
yeah.
Now, would it be so much of an impairment that you yourself couldn't drive? That we don't have a clear handle on. But can secondhand smoke cause impairment? The answer is yes, generally in an enclosed space.
Yeah.
Clay is saying, what about pilots? Is there a testing program for these types of people? We know from earlier in this Facebook chat that
they do have a testing program. I don't know, every airline's going to have their own policy procedures on how they do it.
They would do drug testing in the way that they have previously done it, that this just sort of adds on. But, like the military has said for their pilots, no consumption 28 days before reporting for duty. Which in many cases can essentially mean never, because it's very rare that you would have 4 weeks off.
Yeah.
Air Canada, for instance, has said for a number of safety-sensitive positions, including their pilots, no, you just can't. We're going to have to wrap up here really quickly, but we'll get in Kat's question. What are the rules going to be for camp job sites in northern Alberta? This is an interesting one, where you're required to take urine drug tests. Are you going to be stopped from going to work if you smoke legal marijuana now, or are they going to not acknowledge a positive result for cannabis? So, do you know the answer?
No.
We don't know the answer, so I would start with that. But some of the issues around that are, can they test for it? Well, I think a lot of those work sites do test right now, and they have previously tested for marijuana. So are they going to stop? That would be a question for them. A work camp, you are working most of the time, and then you have your off time as limited as it is. It is a safety-sensitive job. Can you be consuming in your off hours? I think that you're going to have to ask the employer.
Most camps I've been to out west and up north, they have zero tolerance for alcohol and drugs. Period. So, and they have they're very strict on it. Anything you have on you, or if you test positive for anything, you're not working. Yeah. And that's their rule. It's their policy. They can make it whatever they want.
With that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much. I'm David Common with CBC News The National. Randy Digner here is from Industrial Safety Trainers.
Industrial Safety Trainers, yes.
Which is a training company that, amongst other things, is teaching employers right now in the wake of cannabis legalization how to address their employees, some of the issues that they're facing. So industrial safety trainers is Randy's line of work. He's done this for quite a while. Thanks so much for all your questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So that was good.